So we've now arrived at Unit 3. It's a two-part series on culture, Chapter 3 in your textbook. So what are we going to learn in this particular video? In this particular Part 1, we're going to look at understanding what culture means. That means we're going to define culture, look at some of its different features. We're going to look at the influence of values and symbols, language, beliefs, norms, and traditions. And in the second part, in the second video, we're going to look at some of the different elements of culture: subcultures, countercultures, ethnocentrism, and multiculturalism. So let's look at what culture is. Let's define it. Defined as the sum total of the social environment in which we're raised and we continue to be socialized in throughout our life. So what does that mean? That means from the day we're born till the day we die, we experience culture, and our culture evolves. Culture is that shared set of values, beliefs, rules, behavior, objects, and language. Culture is learned. It is non-innate. Culture is passed on from one generation to the next. Culture is socially transmitted and reinforced. And it's used by people to make sense of the world around them. So we know that culture is something that we learn. We learn its language, traditions, art, norms, and values, and it is always changing. Culture is not something that we're born with. No one's going to come to you when your baby is born and say, "Congratulations, it's a boy. He's going to be good at calculus and volleyball, get acne, become a mechanical engineer, be prone to mood swings, marry twice, have 3 kids, and die of heart disease when he's 74. Congratulations." Right? A lot of what happens to in our life is determined by our culture. Let's look at an onion as a metaphor for culture, okay, or as an example that you can use to explain culture. So look at an onion, and you can see the way in which an onion is formed. There's a core, and around the core, layer upon layer upon layer grows. Well, as an analogy for culture, the outer skin, or the outer rings that are visible, are what we call the visible parts of culture. In a few minutes we're going to learn the terminology, but it's the material part of culture. It includes artifacts from culture and patterns of behavior. But the inner rings of the onion, the hidden parts of culture, include things like behavioral norms, values, and beliefs. Those are harder to see and to know. I often use, when I'm teaching about culture, an iceberg metaphor. So I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to travel to the East Coast, for example, and see the wonderful icebergs that are there. But icebergs, usually, when you look at them, only about 25% is visible above the surface of the water. About 75% of the iceberg actually lies below the surface of the water. So like culture, the things that we see in culture, the things that we taste in culture, the things that are visible are just 25%. We call these material culture. So it's the physical artifacts and objects that are found in culture. It's the tangible part of culture, and by that we mean what you can see, what you can hear, what you can taste, and what you can touch. Non-material culture is the 75% of invisible culture. It's the intangible and abstract components of culture, things like symbolic culture and values and norms and sanctions and beliefs. These are all aspects of culture that lack a physical existence. Some examples include ways we talk, song lyrics, forms of behavior. So let's begin by taking a look at some of the material aspects of culture. Right? Remember, those are the artifacts from culture. You may recognize this as a famous landmark of the CN Tower, or Niagara Falls, do you recognize any of those landmarks? or the Rocky Mountains in Canada, or the Northern Lights. So famous landmarks are often associated with specific cultures, but remember, they are a material aspect of culture. Let's take a look at some other examples. Could be a car. Put a picture of my car on here for you guys to look at as an example of material culture. And then I put the one that's in my garage on there for you to take a look at too. It could be clothing or jewelry. Could be wedding dresses. We can see they all have sort of the same symbolic meaning, but in terms of their appearance, they all are culturally bound. Let's take a look at food as an example of material culture. So oftentimes when people ask you about your culture, they're often talking about your ethnic culture, and they want to know the food that's associated with your ethnic culture. Well, guinea pigs, and you may even have a guinea pig as a pet here in Canada, are only treated as pets. But we see in some countries guinea pigs are food, for example in the Andes. Some people eat ants, chocolate-covered bugs. In Cambodia, they eat tarantulas. You can see Angelina Jolie eating one there. You might have tried some of this sponge pudding, strange name, but specific to culture. Brains on the picture on the right. Calamari. And in the picture on the right is a photograph of Tibetan monks drinking something very special in their culture known as Tibetan butter tea. Instruments are an example of material culture. So most cultures have music as an important part of an aspect of their being, but you can see that different cultures have different types of instruments and obviously different forms of music. So those are all examples of material culture. The tangible parts of culture that you can see, you can hear, you can taste, and you can touch. But now we're going to take a look at the non-material aspects of culture, and we're going to look at each specific component: symbolic culture, values, norms, sanctions, and beliefs. So underneath the iceberg is where you really want to delve in order to begin to understand culture. Right? The stuff that's above the surface of the water, very apparent, easy to understand. The large bulk of culture, which lies below the surface of the water, non-material culture, is more difficult to understand. That includes symbols that are objects or images or events used to represent something. It includes norms, the rules and expectations that a society uses to guide the behavior of its members. It includes values, beliefs about ideal goals and behaviors that serve as standards for social life, and sanctions, which are the rewards for adhering to norms and punishment for violating norms. So let's begin by taking a look at the first non-material aspect of culture, that of symbols. Remember, we defined symbols. And symbols imply that there's a shared understanding about their meaning. But keep in mind that meaning can vary across time, and that meaning can vary across contexts. So you might understand this as an accessibility symbol. Many of you will understand this as the apple symbol, the infinity symbol, the Olympic symbol, the tree of life. Flags are a very important symbol to people. So when you look in the environment around you, you will find many symbols used to share common understanding. Let's now take a look at an example of symbolism among Indigenous people. Very important in Indigenous culture is the symbolism of the circle, representing continuity of life. And the significance of 4. We can see here the significance of the 4 directions: north, east, south, and west. All the elements of the earth: wind, fire, earth, and water. Of the seasons: fall, winter, spring, and summer. Of sacred medicines: sage, cedar, tobacco, and sweetgrass, and so on. We also know that there's great symbolism attached for Indigenous people to the eagle feather. And let's take a look at what some of that meaning might be.
The main point with our feathers is it comes from our creation stories. And so there's a point in the creation story where an eagle comes down and he gifts a feather to Glooskap. And he kind of says, you know, this feather is to be a reminder of your responsibility as, you know, as human, not only to the Creator, but also your responsibility to the land, responsibility to all of creation, all those things. You know, what is your responsibility? And this feather is supposed to be a reminder of that responsibility. And so this center stem represents the center of our being, the center of creation, you know, who we are as people. And so everything on the outside is, you know, our life, everything that happens, our surrounding, all this stuff. And so with a feather, just like a human, sometimes things can break off. And sometimes things can become imbalanced. And so you have what looks like a broken feather. But when you look into the center, your feather's always connected, so there's no such thing as broken. And if you know what a feather is like, you'll know that you can put back together that feather just like it was before. You know, the feather is kind of the reminder that we have a responsibility, you know, as people, as humans, to, you know, to live a good path, to be true to ourselves. And so we often use these eagle feathers in prayers and things like that. And so I think that's why, you know, it's significant to have an eagle feather, you know, available for Indigenous people in our court system.
So you can also see the importance of symbols and shared understandings of what those symbols actually mean in law enforcement. So on Blackboard, you'll find a copy of a document from the Canadian Border Service Agency on tattoos and their meanings that come from National Headquarters Organized Crime Section. Just as a few examples here, you can see some of the tattoos that are identified in the slideshow for you. And one of those is the star, and each point on a star can represent a number of years spent in prison. We see numerical tattoos in white supremacist groups, for example, 88 signifying the 8th letter of the alphabet, and a double 8 signifies HH or Heil Hitler. 100%, the expression of pure Aryan or white roots. 420, Hitler's birthday. 18 represents the initials of Adolf Hitler. 23, the letter of the alphabet W, used by white supremacists and skinheads. You can see that some gangs have become a little more sophisticated, recognizing that their tattoos and their symbols are known to law enforcement. So in order to avoid detection by law enforcement, by displaying these shared symbols, sometimes now symbols are done and only visible through black light. Here's another symbol, 3 dots. Usually the 3 dots are seen together in a triangle, signifying prison, hospital, cemetery, representing the path and the ultimate end of a gang lifestyle. So we know that there are a lot of symbols that mean different things. And in this example here, you can see that on the left, in Sanskrit language that dates back to 11,000 years ago, that symbol on the left represented peace and continuity of life. And that symbol was taken by Adolf Hitler and transformed to mean something very different. We know that meanings among symbols can vary, even among color. So you can see in the picture in the left that in some cultures, when people are mourning the loss of life, they often wear all white. And then in other cultures, people will wear all black clothing as a sign of mourning. We know that language is a system of symbols used for communication. Language is shaped by the location where you live and by culture. The video for this unit, Why Indigenous Languages Matter and What We Can Do to Save Them, is an example of the importance of language in culture. Language provides us a way of thinking about the world. This way of thinking reflects our cultural values. It influences the way that we see the world. So languages shape and reflect the reality of cultures. But we know that the meaning associated with language varies across time and place. And it does by nonverbal communication as well. So gestures that mean one thing in one culture can mean something very different in another. So using the A-OK gesture might be okay in North America, but it is very offensive in Brazil. The same with crossing your fingers. Wishing somebody good luck or hoping for good luck can be very offensive in Vietnam. Using a peace sign and flipping that around is the equivalent of shooting someone the finger in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. And using a call like signaling somebody with your finger is extremely rude in the Philippines. So not all gestures mean the same thing, and not all languages mean the same thing. We are culturally bound. So now we've looked at aspects of material culture and aspects of non-material culture, including symbols. We're going to move on now to values. Values are the belief about ideal goals and behavior that serve as standards for social life. So they're really collectively shared ideas about what is right or wrong. So when you look at things like stealing from a store, is that right or is that wrong? That's value-based. To lie, right or wrong. To be honest, right or wrong. Premeditated murder, right or wrong. Now we would always say wrong, but in some situations in a military exercise, it may be not considered wrong. So the next component of culture that we're going to take a look at are norms. And norms are the rules and expectations which guide behavior for people in a society. They are the rules of behavior that tell you what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. They're the expectations of how we're supposed to act and think and look. And we are socially controlled by them. And they are maintained by sanctions when you violate them. A lot of different types of norms. So there's written and unwritten norms. So if they're written and formal, they're written down. If they're just kind of generally understood to be true, then they're called informal and they're unwritten. There is also a different type of norm called prescriptive and proscriptive. And they're basically norms of behavior that tell you things that you should do and things that you should not do. And the way to kind of remember this is remember that the prefix pro is similar to prohibited, meaning it's bad or you shouldn't do it. Okay? So proscriptive, things you should not do. Prescriptive, norms of things you should do. And then there's a categorization of norms based on their level of importance. So mores are the very important norms that exist in a society, and folkways are not really so important. They're more just things involving etiquette. So formal norms are written down, and they involve specific sanctions. So, for example, a law is a formal norm. It's written down. For example, in the criminal code, you break the law, there's a specific sanction with punishment, like jail or a fine. Formal norms could also be a policy. If you follow those policies, a sanction, which is a reward or a punishment, could be you get a promotion. Let's take a look at some informal norms. So remember, informal norms are the unwritten standards of behavior that are generally understood by people who share a common identity. So one such example is brushing your teeth. Another is wearing deodorant. Now I'm going to ask you, is this a formal or informal norm? Falling asleep in a police car. It's likely a violation of a formal norm because there's likely a procedure or policy around police conduct. Now, what would you say from this example? Standing in line to get your food. Formal or informal norm? Well, there's not usually anything written down that says that you have to actually abide by that. So I would say informal norm. A dress code, usually written down, obviously specified there in writing, so formal norm. Picking your nose in public, informal norm. So the written and unwritten, formal and informal norms, we have the different types of norms of things you should and should not do, prescriptive and proscriptive, and we also divide norms by level of importance. So now let's take a look at some examples of things you should and shouldn't do. So examples of prescriptive norms are rules of behavior of what's appropriate, things that are acceptable, that you're expected to do. So if you can start a sentence by saying you should, that means that's a prescriptive norm. Pick up the phone, say hello, something you should do. So what's the prescriptive norm in this picture? Well, it's an informal norm, but it's prescriptive. Then you see a woman who's pregnant and you're sitting down, that you get up and you give her your seat. Nobody says you have to do it, but it's an expectation of behavior. Let's look at proscriptive norms. I always try to avoid that picture of the food in that person's mouth on the right. But proscriptive norms are rules of behavior that's inappropriate or unacceptable. That is, things that you should not do. So obviously talking with food in your mouth, texting during graduation. Obviously, is that a prescriptive or proscriptive? It would be proscriptive, something you shouldn't do. Is this a prescriptive or a proscriptive norm? Be proscriptive. You shouldn't drink and drive. It's also a formal norm. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the level of importance and some examples of mores and folkways. So mores are the social norms that are widely observed, and they determine what is considered morally acceptable or unacceptable. And sanctions for violating mores is far more severe than violating folkways. So examples of these types of taboos are taboos against incest, cannibalism, adultery, plagiarism. They're usually social norms that are considered to be very strongly adhered to within a society, or need to be strongly adhered. So we see examples of incest in Game of Thrones, or examples of adultery, or plagiarism. So folkways are informal norms, and they're based on what we consider to be socially acceptable behavior. And they're not very serious. They usually involve, manners or etiquette, things you should do. And the way that people usually sanction violations of folk ways are usually through expressions of disapproval, like somebody will frown or ignore you or belittle you or say shh or laugh or ridicule or shun you. So, eating or sitting with your elbows on the table is considered bad manners. Talking on your phone in the movie theater, bad manners. The last component of non-material culture that we're going to take a look at are sanctions. Sanctions are both rewards and punishments for adhering or violating any type of norm. So if you have a formal norm, remember one that is written down, and somebody adheres to it, then you might positively sanction them or reward them with a salary bonus or a medal or a diploma. But if they violate that formal written norm, it could be anything depending on the circumstance, from demotion to firing to a ticket to jail sentence to expulsion. Informal norms, remember, those are the folkways that we talked about. And if somebody adheres to informal norms of behavior, they're often rewarded or positively sanctioned with a smile, a compliment, or cheers. And they can be negatively sanctioned or punished if they violate those informal norms with frowns or humiliation, belittling. People might ostracize or shun them. So let's take a look at this example here. So when I have students in Introduction to Sociology in a face-to-face class, we often do what's called the norms breaking assignment. So I have two of my students here who decided to break an informal norm. And as you can see, I don't need to explain to you what the norm violation is. But let's take a look at, and obviously it's an informal norm. There's no law saying you can't wear your bra on the outside of your clothing. And here's the reactions as they're walking down the hallway of Niagara College. What do you see as the sanctions there? Look at the expressions on the faces here. So you can see some maybe are smiling or laughing out of embarrassment. And you can see this is actually a look of shock, which is more of a negative sanction. So what's the norm here? Obey the speed limit. Sign is used to show you that you're not obeying. The type of norm? It's a formal norm. What's the norm and what's the sanction? The norm is that you drive the speed limit. It's a formal norm. And a formal norm, when you violate it, results in a negative sanction, like a ticket, as in the picture here. So in our next video, we'll be moving on to Unit 3, Culture Part 2.